Good afternoon and welcome to the Apheleia Conference Series 2025. And today we have with us Dr. Carlos Alvarez Pereira, which is Secretary General of the Club of Rome, where he leads the Fifth Element program promoting mutual transformation across disciplines, cultures, geographies, and generations towards equitable well-being for all on a healthy planet. He is also a co-founder enabling the highest ambitions for the UN Decade of Sciences for Sustainable Development 2024 to 2033. He is an aerospace engineer and has been a lecturer and researcher in systems dynamics at the Polytechnic University of Madrid, as well as entrepreneur in the digital sector across Europe and promoter of research on complex systems, deep learning, and responsible innovation. Carlos advises the SWEET program on energy transition in Switzerland and is a fellow of the World Academy of Art and Science. And is bringing today the lecture called Fragmentation, Collapse, Emergence, Learning Across Fractures for Planetary Reconciliation. So thank you very much for being here with us. And I ask you to turn on your micro, please. All right, and the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Muito obrigado, Fernando and Luis, for inviting me to share with you and the audience of the Apheleia conferences some provocations, let's call it that, and I will follow a presentation that I will share with you, which is a bit long and dense, but I will give, do my best, to give you the substance in the time, hopefully even less than 40 minutes, to leave time for the discussion with the attendants. So I think I don't need to explain anything about the many crises, the fact that we are living in many crises of different nature at the same time, fractures in societies, but also between societies, wars, and so on, and growing uncertainties. This is, I think, obvious for everybody who has been paying a bit of attention to what has been happening in recent years, and even particularly in recent months and weeks. At the same time, there are many positive things that are happening too, all around the world. It depends on which lens we take. We will see the negative, but we can also see the positive. So one of the questions that I ask myself and we ask ourselves in the Club of Rome is, how do we make sense of the world in which we live? How do we navigate, if you wish, the complexity of our lives, particularly thinking about next generations, about the future, about how will they live, and also thinking about our relationship with the ecosystem, the planet. And in the Club of Rome, in my short definition for what we do is that when we are good, we ask better questions. And the better questions, I mean, questions in general, but in particular, insightful questions help to illuminate our blind spots. And this is what I want to discuss with you, starting, of course, from the example of our organization many years ago. In 1972, we asked this question, we brought to the world the report, The Limits to Growth, which was asking this question: can prosperity or could prosperity lead to collapse? In a world which was not at all asking this question, the world at the time, or certain parts of the world, particularly Europe and North America, were in this long, several decades long trend of material growth and prosperity, and no one wanted to ask this question. But we did. And the results are contained in that book, which is a consideration of multiple scenarios based on a model, on a global model for the first time, computerized model of the world on these five variables that you see here in this graph: population, natural resources, agricultural production, industrial production, and pollution. The model was analyzing the potential evolution of those variables along a long period of time. And it was basically designed to build different scenarios depending on values of the parameters. And what the researchers found is that in most of the cases, in most of the scenarios, but not all, in most of the scenarios, the situation would at some point look like this one that you see here, which is the standard scenario, the business as usual. If no parameters, no fundamental parameters change, what happens? Well, collapse, as you can see, a collapse due to the combination of the exploitation and exhaustion of natural resources, of non-renewable resources, and the growth in pollution. That created a lot of impact that made many people get interest into these questions, and that contributed definitely to the creation of a movement, a big movement, still very much alive, of course, and to the emergence of concepts as sustainable development, the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, and so on. But it also created a lot of backlash. After some time, many people were saying, no, these people of the Club of Rome are doomsayers. They didn't want to get into these questions, and there was not a real scientific controversy about the book. More enthusiasm, interest, or backlash, but not a real controversy. As a matter of fact, we have not solved the question. This is the description of it's a very simplistic summary of where we are, but it's still revealing. Human Development Index is something developed by the United Nations, combining GDP per capita and levels of health and education in different countries, in all countries. And number of Earths, or the ecological footprint, is a concept developed by colleagues in the Club of Rome, Mathis Wackernagel and Bill Rees, trying to measure how many planets do we need to sustain our lifestyle. And the conclusion is that the countries, you see, this graph is very telling. The green rectangle is where all countries should be. Sustainable development, meaning high levels of Human Development Index at a level of ecological footprint compatible with the planet. And no country, as you can see here, no country is inside the rectangle. Some countries are close, but it's not the countries that we typically look at when we talk about development. Because, for instance, the European countries are these blue dots. The European countries, of course, have high levels of development index, but at a very high ecological cost, basically around 3 to 4 planets. And North America is even worse than that in terms of ecological footprint. And a lot of countries in the world which have low levels of ecological footprint also have low levels of human development. And the countries which are close to these are countries in Latin America, in the Caribbean, and in Southeast Asia. So not the typical countries that we have in mind, looking at models of which countries do we want to look like. Very interesting graph also, because if we were doing the animation of what happens with time, the dots move along a line. They come from here. China, for instance, is a good example. Comes from here, and it's now somewhere here. So becoming less sustainable with the development, the increasing levels of human development. So that really poses a big challenge. You know, we have these self-inflicted existential challenges, and we need to find a way to have equitable human well-being for all within a healthy biosphere in a healthy planet. And the two dimensions are not separate. You know, there is a lot of evidence accumulating that in particular, the lack of equity contributes decisively to making our development model not sustainable. So that's one thing we know, but we don't know how to make it. And in a way, I've been using often this picture, you know, in my presentations without mentioning what is this picture, but immediately people identify, this is an illustration for Alice through the looking glass. I feel we are somehow, and it's becoming more and more like that, you know, we're somehow at this threshold, we are crossing from the world we were used to, and where we thought we were in some places much more than others, where we felt comfortable, at least because we knew the rules and we knew a number of things that we don't know anymore, that are being shaken by the reality of these multiple crises together. And then when we cross on the other side of the looking glass, there are some things which still work the same way, but there are also many others which look completely different and work under different logics. Because I think, I mean, this is, as I said, these are my provocations for you. And one of them, and the central provocation of this talk, is about our frameworks of interpretation, the epistemologies, if you wish, that you use, and the relationship between that with our blind spots, with what makes not possible for us to see certain things, or even with what makes possible for us, even if we see them, we don't want to see them. So that's interesting. You know, we have blind spots. We don't have access to reality. We receive perceptions. And yes, we elaborate conscious understanding of those perceptions through frameworks of interpretation. And the gaps between these different levels feed our blind spots. And it's not that we cannot, that we can, you know everything about our blind spots or identify all our blind spots, but at least we have the capacity to know that we have blind spots, and that could make a big difference. And this is what I want to talk about. How do we address these blind spots? As you certainly know, and most probably better than me, we have a dominant epistemology which emerged with modernity. It started emerging, you know, a few centuries ago, although some elements are much older than that. And I put here some attributes of that epistemology, which I think are particularly important. In particular, the idea of separation between humans, us and them, but also separation between humans, humanity, and nature, considering that nature is something different from us. And this idea of separation has nurtured many other of these characteristics, like reductionism, splitting what we want to understand, splitting it to pieces and trying to understand the small pieces to have an idea of how the whole works, and so on. And with this dominant epistemology of modernity, in particular in terms of how we conceive, how we frame, how we think about reality and about where we are, you know, we have separated reality, knowledge, and action giving rise to different disciplines or sub-disciplines within humanities, within philosophy, trying to make the difference between what is, to which we are supposed not to have access, what we understand, what we are capable of knowing, and what should be. And separating these different layers has some consequences, in particular in terms of framing the connectors. Science is there to try to find out what is as much as possible and to make that understandable for us, while other disciplines, like for sure law and ethics in general, but also technology, particularly in the modern world, is what transforms from taking what we understand, transforms into rules and realities and let's say limitations, but also opportunities or potentials, which are very much defining what should be, what we can do and what we cannot do. And these has consequences in terms of how modernity has conceived, through this separation of what is, what we understand, what should be, making them different spaces. This has a lot of consequences in how we conceive, individual and collective well-being. And in particular, it has consequences in the academic space, not only the academic space, but in particular in the academic space, in terms of how we frame, we have built so many and a growing number of academic disciplines in different silos, with their own, each of them with their own frameworks, and a high difficulty in translating or navigating across frameworks, which in itself, in my view, is often creating bigger blind spots, not reducing them. So we know a lot about some narrow approach to a specific topic, and we lose the holistic perspective, but in particular, we lose the understanding of the relationships between the different parts of a system. Also, among the critical elements of how we think or how we predominantly think, there is this idea of linearity, of purpose, and in particular conscious purpose, leading to action and leading to a certain effect. But as a matter of fact, we also know that living systems don't work this way. There are feedback loops. Living systems are more like asking questions, delivering responses which lead to new questions, and so on. And a particularly relevant example could be this, another provocation. Is climate warming a gigantic feedback loop? Unexpected for sure, unintended, yes, as well. At the same time, when we started using fossil fuels, we actually didn't care much about their consequences. While it's quite obvious that they are producing pollution, but we didn't care so much about that. We preferred not to look at that. And now maybe we are in this gigantic feedback loop by which climate warming is impacting on humanity in not a good way, as a form of controlling, as a form by Gaia, of controlling the consequences of our overuse of fossil fuels. Just a question mark to reflect. More generally, I've been thinking about modernity as with this framework that I briefly described, this intellectual or this epistemological framework, as also an history of part of the history in the world in which we have seen several times a self-reinforcing loop in action, a loop which starts with separation between us and nature, but separation between humans, separation acting as a fundamental mechanism at many levels, leading to fragmentation. So, for instance, society conceived as a group of individuals rather than as a group of relationships. And you probably remember the sentence by Margaret Thatcher: there is not such a thing as society, there are only individuals. Well, this kind of approach leads to fragmentation. Fragmentation inevitably lead to fears, because we are actually social animals and life is basically relational. Fears lead to the anxiety for control. The anxiety for control and the imposition of control leads to exploitation, which leads to tension and crisis. And normally we get out of the tension, or modernity has been able to get out of the tension and the crisis often through destruction, massive destruction sometimes, and to an increasing level of separation, to yet another level of separation, and so on and so on. This is a proposal for you to think about. I'm not pretending this is any kind of truth, just a way to ask maybe better questions. Like this one, where we're facing the challenges we are facing because of these three imperatives with which we are living, that we have taken largely separately. Basically, the health of the ecosystem, we have been ignoring it since the expansion of the Industrial Revolution, and particularly in the recent decades. But I mean, it has been like that for a couple of centuries, but we have been basically ignoring that imperative of ecosystemic health, which paradoxically is the most important imperative, because without that, our existence on Earth will end. We are destroying the conditions for our own existence. And then we have been, focused on the other two, the aspiration to affluence, to be materially rich, to the comforts of affluence, while at the same time, and I think it's an essential element of human life or human nature, we feel, the democratic imperative as something also crucial. What we are seeing today, I would say, is that the aspirations to affluence have become something else, which I call rentier imperative. To many thinkers, we are no longer exactly in the same type of industrial capitalism that we were in the 19th and 20th century, but rather now in a kind of capitalism, or whatever other economic, whatever other name we could give to this economic system, because it's rather a neo-feudal system where actually a lot of the energy and investments and focus is on getting the rents. And then might be that we cannot have the three imperatives at the same time, right? Democracy in the sense of dignity, respect for everybody, and not necessarily what we call democracy in the Western sense of the term, but more substantial sense of democracy in terms of dignity and respect for all humans and non-humans through the ecosystem health. Can we make that compatible with the rentier imperative or not? Yet to be discussed. Again, trying to ask a better question. 3 years ago, we started in the Club of Rome a new program called The Fifth Element, deliberately a name trying to bring forward the idea of we have to work with ancient traditions, with all the richness of human knowledge, including those ancient sciences, the traditions of the four elements, air, water, earth, and fire, which combine are necessary for the existence of life, but do not create life just by themselves. There is something else. that in different traditions is called different things. Chi by the Chinese, it's prana in Indian traditions, energy, spirit. This is this fifth element, mysterious fifth element. And we wanted to take that as a way of saying, well, maybe to develop or to not to develop, to resonate with other epistemologies which are already there and have been there since the beginning of times, and new interpretations of those same epistemologies are emerging. In order to do that, we need to weave with all threads of ancient but also modern sciences and wisdom, and learn from life itself, and most importantly, trust people. This program is very much a bet on trusting people and liberating the potential for collective learning. So this approach, but I'm not pretending we are inventing a new epistemology. What I put here as quote unquote the fifth element is ideas, concepts, ways of looking at the world, which have been, as I said, there since the beginning of times. Just need to probably come back to that and reinsert that with a more prominent role in our modern societies. An epistemology based on interdependencies, on the fact that it's the relationships which make the difference. An epistemology which recognizes that our capacities to know are limited and we have blind spots, but which give, a very strong role to creativity, learning, and collaboration, and proposing, that the liberation comes, the liberation from these anxieties or multiple crises in which we are, comes from relationships, from the quality of relationships. This follows this is somehow a tribute to part of the history of the Club of Rome that almost nobody knows, because we are known thanks to the limits to growth. And 7 years after that book, the Club of Rome published this one, trying to respond to a question which was, the limits to growth had a massive impact, sold millions of copies, framed political debates at least in Europe and partially in the US, and yet didn't change the course of things. Why? And the formulation of the response was, well, it's a matter of learning, and how do we develop the potential of humans to learn in different ways different from the conventional. The human gap was defined by Aurelio Peccei, the founder of the Club of Rome, as the difference between our capacity to act and to transform reality and our capacity to understand the consequences of our actions, to understand the feedback loops, and to take care of that. And the bet of this book is that we are able to do that, provided that we learn in ways different from the conventional. We learn in ways which are anticipatory, participatory, and integrative of all knowledge domains. The book is, if you read this, you will feel that it was written yesterday, except for some words which have changed, were no longer used, or for which some other words have replaced them. And yet that was written 46 years ago. More recently, 2020, I wrote this paper, discussion paper, in the context of a new initiative that we started in 2019, the Emerging New Civilizations Initiative, because I really think, and this is also what I would like to discuss with you, is that learning is at the center of the matters I'm putting here, Of course, what does it mean, learning? Because it can mean many different things. First, for me, learning is changing. If So we have not learned until we have changed according to the new knowledge that we have acquired. But also learning can happen at very different levels. And now we really need to learn at a deep level, you know. Just as an example of what I mean by that, learning at different levels. If we take this question, which is essential, you know, it's essential element of our metabolism, of our relationship with the planet, with the ecosystem, you know. The question, if we formulate the question this way, what and how much energy do we need? Still today, we learn something with the Industrial Revolution, not to say that the whole Industrial Revolution is based on this response to the question, the realization that, oh, there is something that now we call fossil fuels, which are extraordinary sources of energy out of very small, in volume, you know, very small quantities of material. You unleash an incredible amount of energy, and we have built the whole industrial societies that we have on that, with a fixed response, which is we need fossil fuels and more and more and more, because we are expanding, population is expanding, and we want to live better, and so on and so on. There is, of course, today, and often the debate on sustainability is too much limited to that. There is another different response to the same question, which is, we have renewable energies, you know, and they work and they are feasible technically and more feasible economically, financially, and so on, you know, and that's where we stop. We haven't learned as a human societies, we haven't learned yet that different response, in the sense that renewables, yes, are growing, but still today, more than 80% of the primary sources of energy come from fossil fuels. But in this response, what we are saying, sort of, is, provided that we shift from one technology to another, we are good, you know, we can keep everything as it was. We can shift, we do not need to question the dream of having cars and several cars over time, because we can shift from cars powered by fossil fuels to cars powered by electricity, which of course in itself is not enough, but we can also think of, and the electricity will be also produced by renewable energy, and that's it. We know that this will not be enough. There are many questions here coming into the scenario of the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. But if the response is a growing amount of energy per capita to sustain human well-being, even with renewable energies, we will face the same issue, which is the planet is finite, because renewable energies are not immaterial. They are based on materials. And as you see these days, now the geopolitics has shifted substantially from fossil fuels, not such a critical matter now in geopolitics for a number of reasons, to rare earth minerals, to critical elements, which are critical for renewable energies and for digital technologies as well. So isn't there something else to learn from this same question? Well, one attempt has been reframing the question, being aware that more ever-growing consumption of resources, whether it is fossil fuels or renewables, is not a solution in the long term. There's been a lot of talk about decoupling well-being from energy consumption, decoupling economic growth from energy consumption, etc., and decoupling, you know, also well-being from material consumption in general. But energy is a good proxy for all consumptions. And the problem is that this is not working, by far not working enough. This is the concept of circular economy. We are far, very far, even today, from achieving circularity, and probably there are big limitations, due to the second principle of thermodynamics, entropy, that says, well, we cannot have a fully circular economy, but at this level, that would be another level of learning for sure, different from just shifting from fossil fuels to renewables. But there might be another level of learning, which would be changing completely the question. Because was it energy is, do we live to consume energy, or do we consume energy to live? What drives health and well-being? And we know, and that's a completely different question. And the learning associated to that question operates at a completely different level. What drives health and well-being? We know that very well since the beginning of time, and based on modern science, it's the quality of our relationships with others, with other humans, but also with nature, if we want to call that. I mean, we are part of nature, but our relationship with other living beings, and I would add with time. And then you are touching, much deeper elements of culture and civilization than just shifting from one technology to another. So this is what I'm talking about when I talk about learning and deeper learning. And our approach in the fifth element, and this is just an hypothesis, we cannot say we have proved it, but the hypothesis that we can and we need to get out of our bubbles, and to learn across the chasms of modernity, of the chasms created or reinforced by modernity, the chasm of humanity versus nature, the chasm, the social fractures, the social divisions, and corresponding polarization, the chasm of developed countries and developing countries. I never use these terms because this implies the idea that there are developed people and developing people. All peoples have the same dignity and the same status. But in practical terms, of course, we are still in neo-colonialism, in neo or not so neo-colonialism. And these words of developed and developing carry that, But the chasm also between modernity versus traditional or originary or indigenous cultures. Can we learn across those chasms? This is the bet that we are trying to explore with the fifth element. Can we learn across generations, across disciplines, with all these silos constrain the role of science, research, and innovation for society, limiting the potential of what could be done across geographies and cultures and worldviews, different worldviews in the world. There are no universal values. There might be some shared ordinary virtues, but the values are different in different cultures. Across separation in general, in particular of economic processes from the biophysical foundations, across status, across languages, something which I think is close also to your heart, not only the verbal languages, the different verbal languages which carry in themselves, they carry different epistemologies to some degree, but also there are other languages which are not the verbal ones. What about the role of artistic practices to shed light on our blind spots and create new meanings? I'm finalizing, just to continue with my questions, what makes the big difference between what I call the epistemology of modernity, of our dominant epistemology of our societies, and what I think would be needed, to address all these issues and to get engaged into these deeper kinds of learning. I think the big difference is what role we attribute to people, to humans in their own cultures, in their own landscapes, in their own ecosystems, their geographies, their histories, And strangely enough, this separation mechanism of modernity is producing a response to that question, which is saying, oh, people are problematic. We have to impose on them, the solutions. Some small groups of very smart people will find the solutions we have to impose on them. But the people, are uneducated, don't understand, and so on, or we find them problematic because they vote for somebody that we don't like. And there is even worse, of course. The main message that artificial intelligence, so-called artificial intelligence, is carrying is we can get rid of humans and we will keep the system going, which means we can get rid of most of humans for the privilege of a tiny minority, and we can get the system going, which is definitely not true. But in any case, this is not a project for humanity as such. You cannot sustain a project for humanity based on the idea that people are problematic. So our bet is that we have to trust the fundamental humanity and dignity of everybody, and through that, liberate the immense potential of learning in relational lives. And that's pretty much it. We call these, the human revolution was an expression used by Aurelio Peccei, the founder of the Club of Rome, in 1984, so more than 40 years ago, to signal the shift in mindset, to signal this deep collective and individual, but particularly collective learning that he thought would be needed to address our challenges. And I think this is more obvious now that we live in this world of fractures, of collapse, and maybe of emergence. And definitely that would mean, a leap forward in sense making, in how we make sense of our place in the world, of our relationships with others, humans and non-humans, and again, with time. Many thanks for your attention.
So, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. We have so far 4 questions, but allow me to say we have a proverb in Portugal, aprender até morrer. It means you shall learn until you die. And so that's the spirit, I believe. So thank you very much. So now I will pass to the questions. We have 3 questions by Nuno Guimarães da Costa and 1 by Erica Robran Gonzalez. Probably I will ask first Nuno's question and then Erica to be more democratic, because Nuno is monopolizing the questions. And for the first question goes like this, by Nuno Guimarães da Costa. Considering what you said on slide 19, the destructive cycle of separation and crisis, aren't there examples of reintegration and positive responses?
Good question. Let's look for them. I think there are examples of restoration of, the examples which exist ultimately share something, but that's a very good question. It could lead to a line of research in itself. But the examples which exist, I think, that's my educated guess, are always based in the restorations of communities, of relationships, of the rehumanizing a context, of making evident that the communities are communities with dense levels of relationship and shared histories, shared cultures, but also a knowledge, a wisdom of governance, of self-governance. Those are the human organizations which are the most resilient and the most capable to address collapse. So I think, yes, although this machine of modernity is very heavy, and typically those examples are cases where there have been collapse and there is restoration, but because the people living in the places, this is very much a place-based argument, have been able to restore the social fabric and their communities and their relationships.
So next question now by Erica and Robran Gonzalez from Brazil. The question goes like this: could you please detail initiatives and results achieved by the Fifth Element project within the perspective of co-creation and transdisciplinarity consolidated by the Bridges Coalition?
Well, the Club of Rome is a small organization of agents provocateurs, if I may, you know. It's not our role to do the work on the ground, but what we decided to do 6 years ago was to engage with partners. You know, we changed our model to be much more proactive in engaging with partners. And but again, our role is to ask better questions. And we have, so for instance, there are two initiatives that we have been developing. One related to what we call intergenerational leadership, which is how do we work? No Limits to Learning was making the point that our main mode of learning is maintenance learning, transmitting an established knowledge from one generation to another, even beyond the context in which that learning was making sense. And there is sort of a conservatism in that learning, which leads to the fact that then society evolves at a different pace, and that creates the conditions for catastrophes. And the book was saying, and the other mode of learning is catastrophe learning, you know, and we can do better than that. So one aspect is maybe we can do better than just maintenance learning and catastrophe learning if we involve different generations together in the learning process of what does it mean, you know, to live in the 21st century. And the younger generations are no longer passive receivers of whatever the older generations have done. You know? And so we have been working on that in a multiplicity of contexts and actions since 3 years now. And this is very inspiring. And it's not about, oh, let's sit some young people at our table. It's really about, can we transform this vertical mode of learning into a mode in which the learners are driven the learning, and the younger generations are together with the old learning. You know? And the second example is the number of actions that we are developing to try to move the lines of the role of research and innovation and science for society. And the Bridges Coalition, of which we are part, is part of that, you know, bringing to the fore the point that, you know what, sustainability is not a matter of natural sciences only. Humanities, all social sciences and humanities have to play a crucial role in that. And even beyond that, what we achieved was to get approved by the UN General Assembly a declaration of the Decade of Sciences for Sustainable Development, in which, and this is a UN declaration, you know, so politically important, but of course the whole thing is to be developed. But it says some very important things. One is that sciences have not been contributing or not enough to sustainable development. It's time for mobilization, and the mobilization has to be across the disciplines, from natural sciences to social sciences, humanities, artistic practices, and traditional knowledge. So this is the kind of things that we can do in the Club of Rome, not working on the ground. Many other people are doing that, and we try to highlight their work. We are dedicated to asking these better questions, to do the provocations in the places where it can have an effect in changing, the perspective.
So, third question now two more questions by Nuno Guimarães da Costa, and in a minute I will ask Luís Osterbeck if he has any question. So, the other question by Nuno Guimarães da Costa is, we seem to have asked all the good questions, and we also seem to have answers. Why is there no actual change, or is it there?
Well, very good. The change is there for sure. There are many seeds of global change. Our consumption of change. This is exactly the question that I formulate as how could we learn what we already know? Because we know since very long time, in the case of the Club of Rome, since 50 years now, a number of issues, but we have not been able to learn them in the sense of changing. What is preventing us from doing that? A number of factors, but particularly this sense-making, the limitations of sense-making in the current dominant paradigm. And part of that, for instance, is I often hear, oh, you know what, we know the solutions, we have the solutions have been defined by the scientists, but we are just not able to apply them because there is no political will. And then my point is, no, then we don't have the solutions. Solutions that cannot be applied are not solutions. And there are two factors here which are critical. One, again, is the fragmentation between academia and policymaking, to say something, because, expecting that by some kind of miracle, the knowledge produced by academia will land on the tables of policymakers in a way such that they will be able to apply that to policies, that's very naive. It doesn't happen like that if you are living in different bubbles, the bubble of academia, the bubble of policymaking. So defragmenting the relationships between these different sectors, science and policymaking, is one element. And the second element, and even more important, is you need the people. You need, so it's not only science policy, the science policy interface which has to change, that you have to create science policy society interface. You have to give the protagonism to people. This idea that some scientists will find a solution, transmit them to policymakers who will impose them on the people. That's very naive, particularly in certain countries, in certain cultures. And this has been generating the backlash that we are seeing, not involving the people, not making the people the protagonists of the responses. I used to say, we have to change this whole hierarchy in which we say top-down initiatives and bottom-up initiatives. Well, why don't we shift it, Because at that top, we have the multilateral system. At the bottom, we have people on the planet. But the people on the planet cannot be the bottom. What if we put people on the planet at the top and we said, and the rest of institutions are there to serve? And then we would see, and this is part of what we are trying to do, and then we would see the seeds of the new. We would see the places and the initiatives and the concrete cases in which, of course, with help, but communities have been able to change the responses and to address the crisis and to define, their own pathways to resilience and to regeneration.
Thank you. So if Nuno doesn't mind, we have a question now by Luís Osterbeck, and I will come back again to Nuno that I just saw entering the Zoom meeting. So by the question of Luís Osterbeck is like this: what can the implications of the tensions between environment and security, for example, the Green Deal and the war efforts, and of the disinvestment in science and research in many regions, for instance, in the Global Gateway for Africa. And there's another one from Wish also, that is the rest of the question, actually. What can be the impact of the current US pressure to delete the use of certain words like diversity or cultural heritage, but also historically in NSA or Fulbright-supported projects? Did you get, Carlos, or shall I?
No, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, this is a very relevant question in the space in which we are now, or in the context in which we are now. My take on this is, let's take the current situation, because I hear quite often around, and in particular from people living related in some way or another to the multilateral system, I hear them saying, oh, the system is crumbling down because the US is taking a number of decisions that are going against what they themselves created, because the UN system was not created by some extraterrestrial body. You know, US was leading the creation of the multilateral system just after the Second World War, and now they are getting out of it. Interestingly, this did not start now. They started 40 years ago with the presidency of Reagan. That's another story. So there are consequences for the US themselves. It looks like, in some ways, it looks like, oh, these people are don't want to be anymore the hegemon, and they're doing a number of things to say, I disconnect from the multilateral institutions, I disconnect from the world. Well, interesting, but there are also consequences for the rest of the world. And when I hear the system is crumbling down, and normally we say, oh, these people who are feeling the pressure directly say there is no alternative. My immediate reaction to that is, well, let's wake up, you know, because this crumbling down of a system which was dysfunctional anyway, and it's not Trump who has created the dysfunctional system. The international relations have been always about interests, not values. They have been always transactional and implacable. It's just that now this has become more obvious, you know, because of the things that Trump is doing. But then this is the moment that might be the opportunity. So this is why this matter of framework of interpretation, how do we make sense, is so important. Because one way to make sense of the current situation is that we're hearing in Europe by the leaders is, oh, we have to rearm ourselves instead of investing, instead of continuing, you know, making research and innovation play a critical role for sustainability. Now we have to invest in rearming ourselves and preparing ourselves for a war with Russia. This is one way of making sense, which doesn't make any sense to me. And I think it's a regressive way of making sense. Another way of making sense is, okay, we now live in a different world order, which has not yet emerged. Can we make this world order more equitable, more respectful of the plurality of worldviews, of cultures, of countries in the world, less focused on hegemony, on global hegemony or the fight for hegemony, but more a pluriversal world, a world where different cultures develop their own pathways to a sustainable future. So the impacts that Luis was asking about are of course very important. Now what matters most, and depends on where you are seated, you know, the impact can fall directly onto your head because the people who are being fired because of the cuts to US aid, to say something. But what we have to, I think what is important is how we make sense of the situation and the potential opportunity in which we are. Or do we keep in framings, in binary framings of us versus them, and engage in a circular kind of fight in which the binary, both sides of a binary scheme reinforce each other, you know, or do we get into something else?
All right, thank you. We have the last question by Nuno. How do you solve the challenge between short-term and long-term demands? Or, which is the same, how to cope with short-term social needs and long-term environmental constraints? For example, jobs versus ecology.
Well, environmental constraints are no longer long-term. Let's get out of this idea first. They are not long-term, you know. Destruction of ecosystems is happening in many places with direct consequences, and climate change is there with already, you know, manifest consequences and so on. Ask the insurance companies, you know, how is it going? You know, how the impact, or look at the frequency of natural disasters, how it is increasing, you know, how fast it is increasing. So there is not a dilemma in terms of timescales between the social and environmental, but I would say more. There is, these two dimensions are not separate. This has been a big mistake, in my view, in the evolution of the ecological movements, that, you know, they have been focusing on preservation of the environment, and while, you know, largely ignoring the social dimensions. We cannot make one without the other because we are humans, so we don't even experience the environment other than being humans. And my point is, if we if we shift the system in order to put the people on the planet at the top and the strength of communities at the top, then you address both issues at the same time. I know this is a bit abstract. We'll have time now to develop that. But the option, the way out, is by bringing both dimensions together and putting people on the ground in their landscapes, in their ecosystems, as protagonists of the responses. And then they will find, as they have been doing for centuries, maybe millennia in many cases, you know, through self-organization of solutions like the ones that Elinor Ostrom analyzed, you know. This is where you reconcile the social and the environmental, and you dissolve that separation.
No, it looks like there is no any other question, and we are in the time for closing. And so thank you very much again. If anyone else wants to add something, nobody, such as Luis, do you want to? Yes, Luis, please.
Just a final comment. Thank you, Carlos, for this very interesting overview. I think the efforts that you have been conducting for many years, and certainly the Club of Rome, are of major importance. My question a few minutes ago related to the concern that changes in vocabulary, conditioning scientific research in such an important country for research as the US may, to a certain extent, change in due course the way of publishing for many people. Take the word diversity, for example, which is one of the words that goes into the index, or the word historically, which tends to ban historical understanding of the processes, which, for example, for the fifth element would become very tricky. And because a large part of the world research is funded by the US, this might have an impact. Having said this, I think what you said is perfectly true and offers us a good path to keep on doing things. So thank you very much, Carlos.
If I may add something.
Of course.
I mean, what is happening, I fully agree with you. What is happening is, you know, I often quote Karl Deutsch, a political scientist from second half of the 20th century, when he said, power is the ability not to have to learn anything. And so opposing power and learning. And here we have this extreme case, you know, and when people start, or power starts to develop institutions which are controlling what can be said or not, and I'm speaking as a Spaniard, you know, from a country which invented the role of the Inquisition, you know, and we had that during 500 years. You are actually limiting tremendously your capacity to learn anything new. You are cutting, you know, the possibility of having diverse epistemologies and then from there illuminating the blind spots and so on. So if I were a US citizen, I would be really worried about the trajectory of the USA. For the world, for humanity as such, I think we have to face reality and build alternatives. Maybe we have to start welcoming US or scientists based in the US. We have to welcome them in exile, you know, in other places to keep the learning process going, you know.
So we could be speaking here for another hour, but unfortunately we have to close. It was a great pleasure. And let's keep in touch, I hope. I have a very brief question for you. You mentioned an article by you, Learning New Ways of Becoming Human. Where can I find this article? I believe it's an article or a book.
No, it's an article. It's a brief that I wrote for the Club of Rome. It is on the website of the Club of Rome, but
Perfect. I will try to get it. Thank you very much again. So let's close. It's time to close, unfortunately, and all the best for all of us. And let's keep about thinking on positive things that there still exist. Okay. Take good care.
Muito obrigado.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye.